All right, time for our second talk. I know there's a tight room. We're working on getting a few more chairs to squeeze a few more people in, so bear with us with there. But Erin Medvecz is with the University of Illinois Extension, and she's going to be giving our next talk about resisting invasion.
Thank you, Chris. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. As Chris said, I work for University of Illinois Extension down in Southern Illinois. But today I'm going to be talking to you about the research that I conducted when I was a master's student at SIU from 2015 to 2017. And so we're going to be talking about how native plant communities interact with an invasive legume. And to kind of set the stage, I wanted to start by talking about an invasion scenario that most of us are very familiar with. So either an agency or a private landowner has a piece of land, and we'll be talking about grasslands today, so I'll use that as my example. And they're managing that piece of land, and unfortunately, an invasive species comes in. And what often happens is their management priority then shifts to trying to eradicate or get rid of that invasive plant. So they focus on trying to get rid of it. I left one up there because we know it's really hard to completely eradicate an invasive species. But I didn't want to focus on looking at how to manage invasive species. There's tons of research happening on that right now. I wanted to look at what happens to those communities when an invasive plant comes in. So if we set the stage a little differently, and we know that we have some native plant communities already established, what happens to those when that invasive comes in? So in some cases, we may lose part of a population. We may make it easier for a population to increase its numbers with that invasive plant present. It might also allow for a whole new species to come into a community. So these interactions were more what I was looking at with my research. And another thing I wanted to look at is, are there certain species in a community that if we increase their numbers or if we introduce them, a desirable native species, if we add something in, can it act as a defense mechanism so that if that invasive tries to come in, it's not able to establish? So these are kind of the questions that I wanted to look at through the research that I conducted, rather than looking at how do we eradicate, how do we get rid of this invasive plant. So I decided to look at Lespedeza cuneata, commonly known as Sericea lespedeza. I'll refer to it as Sericea or Lespedeza throughout the rest of this talk today. And this is an invasive, non-native nitrogen-fixing legume that was introduced from Asia in the 1800s. It was intentionally planted in the southeastern part of the United States for erosion control. It was also planted as a forage crop and to help reclaim degraded land. Some of its characteristics that make it a really great invader is once it comes in and establishes, it can grow up to 6 feet tall, and then it has a tendency to kind of flap over and form a carpet. And this results in shading of all of the native plants that are growing in the same area. Its seeds that it produces hundreds of thousands of every year can persist in the soil for over 20 years. I've also seen up to 30 years. So once it establishes and sets seed, it's very difficult to get rid of. Also in the soil, it's allelopathic, so it produces and spreads chemicals, and because it is a nitrogen-fixing legume, it can also change the levels of nitrogen in the soil. So it does a lot of things that are not the best. This is its current distribution. You can see that it is located in the southeastern part of the United States, but is spreading all the way to Texas and a few populations up in Wisconsin and Minnesota. I'm not sure if it's limited, its spread is limited by climatic factors. Studies haven't been conducted to see how it's spreading, but this is its current distribution as of right now. But you can see that it's pretty well established in Illinois as well. And unfortunately, there's been a low success of control using any one of these methods alone. So grazing, even though it was planted as a forage crop, once it gets old enough, the stems turn woody and the leaves have a high tannin content, so it's not palatable to grazers. Goats have been found to eat it, but you don't really want to put goats out in a high-quality natural area because they're not just going to eat the Sericea, they're going to eat a lot of other things that you don't want them to eat as well. Fire helps promote its growth, biocontrol doesn't do that great, and an herbicide application alone hasn't been shown to be super successful. The control that has had the most success is integrated management, so combining fire early in the season with an herbicide application has been shown to help get that Lespedeza gone. However, with a seed bank that persists for 20 years, you're going to have to do that treatment over and over and over again, and you can start to compromise your native plant community in that process. Okay, so again, overall, what I wanted to look at through my research was how Sericea is working above and below ground to determine species composition, what species are growing in our grasslands, and I decided to do this through a combination of field surveys and a greenhouse experiment, and we'll talk about both of those today. So to start with my field surveys down in southern Illinois, I basically asked the question, are there differences in the species composition, where Sericea is growing and where it's not growing within an infested grassland? So what I did was I found 15 grasslands in southern Illinois that were invaded by Sericea. Okay, so they had different stages of invasion, they were different ages, they had different soil types, different site quality. And within each of those sites, as you can see in that diagram there were areas where Sericea was growing and there were areas where it wasn't growing. So I didn't choose sites that were just a monoculture of the species. That wasn't what I was looking for. I was looking for sites that had Sericea invasion in parts of it, but also not in other parts. And that allowed me to set up plots so that I could compare what species were growing where Sericea was present and what species were growing where Sericea was not present. So I set up that design, and then I did 2 survey rounds in the summer of 2016, and each time recorded what species were present and gave an estimate of their percent cover. Here are my study sites, and if you look over here, you can see I was located down in southern Illinois, as I said before. I had kind of a centralized location at Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge because the lab that I was in had done previous research on Sericea there, so I kind of used that as my focal site. But then expanded out up at Pyramid State Park, down at the Cache River Wetland Center, and then some other sites in the Shawnee National Forest as well, to kind of generalize and try to find if there were any regional trends on how Sericea was changing and interacting with our native plant communities. So compiling all of that data and doing a whole bunch of complex analyses that I'm not going to go into, this is what I found. So regionally across the 15 sites, this just kind of gives you a picture of what species were growing there. So the 2 most abundant plants were Canada goldenrod and big bluestem. Sericea came up as number 3, and in the plots where it was present, it averaged about 20% cover. But that again ranged from nearly 100% cover in some plots to just a few plants and a few other plots. You can see some other undesirable plants. Japanese honeysuckle was number 4 on the list. So again, these sites that I found were not necessarily all of the highest quality, and they all had various differences in their species diversity and quality again. Okay, so doing analyses across all of those 15 sites, what we found was that there were no significant trends across the whole region. So basically comparing all of the plots where Sericea was growing and where it wasn't growing, there was no significant difference in the species composition, okay? And that's not super surprising. But what we did find was basically the differences were based on site. So my sites differed greatly. And so all of those differences between all of my different grasslands kind of overwhelmed any differences that we'd find between plots where Sericea was growing and where it wasn't growing, okay? This right here is an ordination, and it is a little bit difficult, but I'm going to try and simplify it for you to explain what it means here. Okay, so if we just look at the 2 different colors of dots, the dots that are dark blue indicate plots where Sericea was growing, okay, and the gray dots indicate plots where Sericea wasn't growing. And what we'd expect to see if there were differences in species composition was one group of blue dots and one group of gray dots that didn't overlap. You can see that's not what we see here at all. Everything's overlapping, and so that just shows that there were no significant differences in species composition, okay? But again, not super surprising to find that looking across the region. So then what I did is I analyzed each site individually, okay? So I didn't stop here. I wanted to dig a little bit further and see what we could find. So looking across each site, I found that within the sites, half of them did have differences. in the plots where Sericea was growing and where it wasn't growing, okay? So if we looked on a smaller scale, there were some significant trends, okay? So again, in this ordination, you can see that there is some grouping and some separation between the colors of the dots, which again shows that there were some different species compositions where Sericea was growing and where it wasn't growing. So in some ways, that invasion was affecting or impacting what plants were growing, okay? Some other trends that we noticed is 4 of our sites had greater abundance of forbs or wildflowers in the present plots where Sericea was growing. And a few of the sites had higher grass abundance where Sericea wasn't growing, okay? So starting to look at some overall trends. But one of the most telling things that I found was that there was a significantly greater amount of grasses and legumes found in plots where Sericea wasn't growing. Okay, you can see here in the absent plots that there was a much greater abundance of grasses and of legumes. Okay, so a much lower abundance in present plots. Now this could be one of 2 things. There's 2 possible explanations for this. Either Sericea is able to suppress grasses and legumes where it's growing, or grasses and legumes might provide some kind of invasion resistance against Sericea in these grasslands. And looking back at the literature, we found that that latter one is probably what was occurring. So grasses as a functional group are able to prevent invasion regardless of what type of invasive species is coming into an ecosystem. And because Sericea is a legume in and of itself, if there were already a whole bunch of legumes established in a community, it's going to be a lot harder for another legume to come in because that role in that ecosystem is already kind of filled, and it's going to be more difficult for it to come in and establish. Okay, so this right here was one of the main trends that we found, that perhaps if we have a higher abundance of grasses and legumes, we can have a more resistant grassland to invasion by Sericea. Okay. So remember that, because we'll come back to that in a little bit. But shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to talk about the greenhouse experiment that I conducted as well. And through this, what I really wanted to do is look at the mechanisms by how Sericea invades communities. So I wanted to see, is it exerting competitive shading above ground? So how is it working above ground? But also, what is it doing below the soil? And what's the relative strength of these effects on native plants? Okay, so then below the soil, I wanted to see, is it changing the nitrogen content because it is a nitrogen-fixing legume? And is it also changing the soil microbial communities that we have in the soil? So what is it doing below the ground? Okay, and how was I going to determine what these effects were? Well, I was going to look at the effects on the growth of native plants. Okay, so I wanted to see if native plants grow differently in their responses to above and below ground interactions with this Sericea, with this invasive legume. And I also wanted to look and see if their responses differed based on their functional group. Okay, so I looked at forbs, or wildflowers, grasses, and legumes. Okay. A little bit more about my greenhouse experiment. If I wanted to look at the below ground effects of Sericea, what I had to do was create soil, or find soil, but I chose to create soil that had been changed or affected, or what we like to call conditioned by Sericea. So we went out in the field at Crab Orchard and found a site where Sericea had not been known to be growing. We collected soil, brought it back to the greenhouse, processed it, and then I grew Lespedeza seedlings in that for 10 weeks to condition or change that soil. So now, at the end of that time period, I had soil that hadn't been changed by Sericea, and I had soil that had. Okay, so I was able to have 2 different soil treatments to compare those below ground effects. I then set up my experimental design, which I'll talk about in the next slide, and then grew everything for 9 weeks, taking measurements on 9 different plant traits. Okay, again, this is my experimental design. So we talked about already, I had those 2 different soil treatments to look at below ground effects. To look at above ground competition effects, I had 3 different treatments. I had a treatment that was no competition. I had a treatment that was competition with the invasive Sericea, okay. But I also wanted to add in a 3rd treatment, because if you just compare a plant growing by itself versus a plant growing with your competitor, you're not able to parse out if the effects on another plant's growth is just due to competition or if it's due to competition with that invasive plant in particular. So what I chose to do was add in a native Lespedeza competitor in order to kind of add another comparison to say, hey, there's just the effects due to competition, but there's also these extra effects due to competition with that invasive plant in particular. Again, I looked at the effect on 9 native species, 3 from 3 different functional groups, so 3 grasses, 3 forbs, and 3 legumes. And then I replicated everything 4 times, so I had 216 pots in the greenhouse. Okay, a few more words just on that native Lespedeza that I chose. Lespedeza capitata, also known as round-headed bush clover, is a native grassland legume. It is palatable, unlike Sericea, high in protein, and it's desirable in our native seed mixes. It's pretty rare down in southern Illinois, but it is still found in some of our grasslands. And then the study species that I chose to monitor and look at the effects of that Sericea below and above ground. 3 grasses, big bluestem, Indian grass, and switchgrass. My forbs were Canada goldenrod, foxglove, beard tongue, and gray-headed coneflower. And then my legumes were partridge pea, tick truffle, and wild senna. And I chose these plants because they are representative of our southern Illinois grasslands and based on seed availability as well. Okay, so before we look at how these native plants responded, we need to see what happened with the soil. Because remember, we grew Sericea in the soil to change it, okay? And what we found was there was a lot less nitrate and nitrite in the soil where Sericea had been growing, which was the opposite of what we were expecting, okay? We were expecting the nitrogen-fixing legume to add nitrogen into the soil. But what probably happened is my unconditioned soil didn't have a plant growing in it in the time that Sericea was growing in the other soil. So as a plant grows, it uses nitrogen. So as the Sericea was growing, it was probably depleting the nitrogen levels in the soil, even as it was starting to fix nitrogen. So if I did this experiment again, I would have grown a different native plant in that unconditioned soil to kind of control for that depletion of nitrogen that occurs. We also found on the chart on the right that there were some increases in the amount of soil microbes that were occurring in the soil, but again, nothing really significant that we were expecting to find. Okay, and the effects on the native plants in the soil were really minimal. So again, those below ground effects that we were expecting to find, we didn't really find them. Okay, so our grasses had a slight increase in height and below ground biomass. But none of the other native plants were affected by those soil effects. The Sericea in and of itself didn't benefit by growing in its own soil, which has been found in other studies. And then when we looked above ground, this is where we started to see some trends. So competition did reduce the growth of some of our functional groups to differing degrees based on who they were growing in competition with. Okay. So the trend that we found was that plants performed the best when they were growing by themselves. They performed a little bit poorer when they were growing with that native Lespedeza competitor. And then there was another poorer growth when growing with that invasive competitor. Okay, so we did see that downward trend. And this was found in the total biomass of the plants, their below ground biomass, their root length, and their overall height. But the most telling result that I found actually came from something that I wasn't planning to study. But while I was taking all of these measurements in the greenhouse, measuring the growth of these native plants, I also measured the growth of those Lespedeza species, so the native and the invasive that I was studying. And what I found was these overall trends, and it looks like a lot of data, but I'm going to simplify it for you. So up here, we have 9 different traits that I measured. Total biomass, above ground, below ground biomass, height, root length, number of root nodules, and a few other characteristics here. The red color is the growth of the invasive Sericea, and then the white circles is the growth of the native. And then on the bottom here, the left-hand column represents the growth of those Sericea or the round-headed bush clover when it was growing and competing with a forb. And then on the right-hand side when it was growing with a legume and a grass in the middle. What we see, if I add on these extra bars here, is that the growth of that native plant didn't really differ depending on whichever functional group it was growing with. So no matter if that native Lespedeza was growing with a forb, a grass, or a legume, its growth was relatively the same. But what we found with the invasive is that overall there was definitely a really strong trend, with the invasive Sericea growing the best when it was competing with forbs and performing the worst when it was growing with legumes. again, if we think back to what we found in the field surveys, we found that there was a much greater abundance of legumes where Sericea wasn't growing, okay? And here we find that Sericea doesn't really perform that well when it's competing with other legumes. So again, tying that all together and adding on this little chart here, we see that the native Sericea grew similarly, or the native Lespedeza, excuse me, and then the invasive Sericea definitely had different performance, different growth. It didn't do as well growing with legumes, and it performed the best growing in competition with forbs. So again, kind of putting this all together, we did see a stronger effect of those competition effects, those above ground effects, than those soil effects, okay? And we did find a variation in how Sericea performed when competing with different functional groups. In the field, we saw grasses and legumes provided some invasion resistance. And in the greenhouse experiment, we saw that Sericea performed the best when it was in competition with forbs. So overall, this leads to a few management recommendations. The first one is that we might want to consider planting a high proportion of grasses to increase invasion resistance. Now, a lot of us, when we're managing for a grassland, we don't really want more grass because that comes really easily. What we want to do is increase that diversity. We want to add some more wildflowers and forbs. But if we want to do that, we might consider choosing to increase diversity by planting more legumes, okay? Again, if we're able to increase the amount of legumes that are filling those niches in the ecosystem, we might make it a little bit harder for that Sericea to come in and fill that role of a legume in our ecosystem. And then again, we saw, because there was a lack of consistent results across all of the sites, we have to monitor on a local scale to determine what's actually happening in our ecosystem with that invasion that occurs. So again, to conclude, unfortunately, Sericea's effects vary by site. It makes it a lot more difficult for us, that it's not just an easy answer on how it affects our native plant communities. We did find that functional groups were really useful tools. So grouping plants by forbs, grasses, and legumes really helped us out, and we were able to see some strong, significant effects. So this means that if you went out to monitor your site and you didn't necessarily know what every single species was, if you're at least able to start grouping them by grasses, forbs, and if you know a few of the legumes, that can be a useful start for you, and you might not necessarily have to know everything that you have there. And again, as we all know, invasive species effects are often dynamic and scale dependent. Okay, so with that, I do have a few acknowledgments just from everyone at SIU who helped support my research. The Illinois Association of Environmental Professionals, which provided my funding, and then all of my survey sites listed down at the bottom. And then with that, I do have time for questions.
Wow, what a presentation.
Yeah.
What research. How has this spread? Has it spread naturally or through the waterways? Or,
oh, the spread of Sericea.
Yes.
That's a good question. It's not spreading through the waterways, but it is spreading through movement of equipment that were management equipment. And then once it establishes and gets that seed bank in, it's really there to stay. So I know at Crab Orchard it established in one of their sites, but then if they're managing the whole area with all of that equipment, then it really easily spreads throughout the whole spot. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Is it an annual or a perennial?
It's a perennial. Yes.
Would planting more forbs in an area help resist an invasive forb? Since your legume did the...
Right. That's kind of the trend that I saw here with my research. So again, it would depend on the specific invasive, but that's kind of the trend that we saw, that if you're able to fill that functional group, that role in the ecosystem, it might provide more resistance. Mm-hmm. Yes, Kevin.
So most of your sites look like they were in restored,
Yes.
quote-unquote, restored grassland.
Yeah.
So do you think there would be much difference if you were looking at more intact natural areas versus those restored grasslands?
Right. There might have been. There were a couple natural, at least two, that weren't restored grasslands that I had in my site. And I'm trying to think. based on those site trends individually. Yeah, there might be some differences, but again, just based on where we were located in southern Illinois, that's the type of grassland we had. And, you know, with all of the loss that we've had throughout the state, that was kind of the representative grassland that we have. But perhaps it could be different if it was a more natural, intact ecosystem. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
You could add Peoria County to your distribution chart on this. I'm facing it in at least 2 places up there.
Okay.
What you're telling me is that where I have the Sericea,
Mhm.
if I put in brown-headed bush clover, it might help out competing.
It could, because it's in that same functional group. It's a legume as well.
Any other specific plants that I could see in there?
Again, I can talk to you afterwards if you want specific recommendations. Yeah. All right.
Got time for a question or 2 more?
Okay, yes.
Did your statistics account for just diversity or also abundance of different species?
It was both. I kind of skipped over all the heavy stats for you. Yes.
I've heard through time that the seed from Sericea Lespedeza is detrimental to native songbirds and galliforms because of that piece that sticks off of it lodges in their esophagus. Do you know, is there any empirical evidence to suggest negative effects on wildlife?
That I haven't heard of that. That's the first one that I've heard. No, not that I know of. No.
Twice.
All right. Thank you very much.